What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Kendall Rae's channel. As you can tell, I'm not Kendall Rae, but I am her husband, Josh. Kendall is still on maternity leave and will hopefully be returning to her channel at the end of the month. But Kendall and our new baby are doing wonderfully. She's been spending lots of time with her, getting to rest and sort of work her way back into YouTube and recording and all that good stuff. Thank you for all the well wishes and love and support from you guys. We really do appreciate it. Kendall's doing amazingly, baby's doing amazing, and she will be back soon. But today I'm going to be filming a video on her channel for her. She asked me if I wanted to do it, and I said, absolutely. If you've been watching Kendall Rae for a long time, you've probably seen my face before. I used to do a series on her channel called Trippy Talk, and we do a bunch of like unsolved mysteries, Stonehenge, Roswell, all that sort of good stuff. But that was like 4 or 5 years ago. Otherwise, you might have seen my face from the Mile Higher podcast, which I co-host with Kendall. If you haven't checked that out yet, it's a great podcast. I also host a spooky paranormal podcast called Lights Out. So if you want to check that out, I would love for you to. I've got the links below in the description for you, but you may have seen me online or social media as Mile Higher Josh as well. But yes, I'm Kendall's husband and I'm here to do a true crime video for you today. Specifically, today I'm going to be focusing on Thomas Cullen Davis because he is an interesting individual. He is a very, very wealthy man, or he was a very, very wealthy man. And let's just say that the criminal justice system really didn't apply to him. And you'll see what I'm talking about here in a little bit. But let's go ahead and jump right into this because we've got a lot of ground to cover here. And it's very important that we take a look at the background of Thomas Cullen Davis before we get into the actual crime that gets committed. So let's go all the way back to the very beginning so that we can really understand who Thomas Cullen Davis is. So Thomas Cullen was the second of 3 sons born into the Davis family. He exclusively went by Cullen though, instead of Thomas. So that's what I'm going to be referring to him as throughout this video. Cullen was born on September 22nd, 1933 to Kenneth Davis and Alice Bound. His parents actually originated from Pennsylvania, but him and his brothers were actually born and raised in the Fort Worth, Texas area. Their childhood and early adult lives were heavily influenced by their father's work. He was a major oil tycoon. He worked his way up the corporate ladder and transformed Mid-Continent Supply Company into Ken Davis Industries International Incorporated, which manufactured goods used in the petroleum industry. During this time, there was a major oil boom in Texas, so a lot of people were getting filthy rich off of extracting oil. And the Davis family was definitely taking advantage of this boom. Kenneth was a very strict man, and despite being a millionaire, he kept a very tight budget. Even as the 3 boys grew up, they lived with Kenneth at his estate and were expected to join him in the oil business. It was a family business, so they were going to take over once Kenneth retired. It was very important to Kenneth that Cullen and his brothers abided by his wishes. He kept a very sort of tight hold on them and really wanted them to follow in his footsteps. Cullen had a pretty normal childhood, and he actually ended up attending Texas A&M for college because his father said it was a cheap but difficult school. He didn't play any sports, but he enjoyed sailing and playing pool with his friends. It didn't take long for Cullen to marry his first wife, Sandra Masters, on August 29, 1962. And this marriage, let's just say, wasn't filled with love. He ended up marrying this woman because his father loved her. So of course he wanted to please his father, so he went through with the marriage. Cullen and Sandra had 2 children together named Cullen Jr. and Brian. Because of their family's immense wealth, the Davis family was all about the elite social circles, about their reputation, and sort of how they were viewed to the public. Cullen from the jump had a reputation of having a bad temper and also just being generally creepy towards women. There was also a rebellious side to Cullen. He definitely didn't like what his father was making him do, and he was always trying to find ways to sort of go against him. It was this sort of behavior that put Cullen's first marriage at risk. By the mid-1960s, Cullen and Sandra's marriage was barely hanging on by a thread. The 2 were still technically married, but Cullen started seeing someone new. Cullen was a member of the Petroleum Club, and in this Petroleum Club, he'd go socialize, hang out, drink, and play tennis. And it was at this club that Cullen met a woman named Priscilla. Priscilla, at the time, was also married. One day, while both of them were at the club playing tennis, Cullen approached Priscilla to see if her and her husband wanted to play doubles with them. Priscilla was actually at the club with her husband, Jack Wilborn, which was her second husband at the time. The couple had 2 children together. Their names were Jackie and Andrea. And Priscilla actually had another child named Dee from a previous marriage. And although her second husband was a very successful man, Priscilla was always looking for the next best thing. And for whatever reason, this day, Cullen happened to be that. Their paths crossed, and they sort of hit it off immediately. Meeting Cullen that day was perfect timing because her and Jack were actually going through a divorce at the time. So what better time to meet somebody new? After the tennis match was over, the couple parted ways, but Priscilla actually ended up seeing Cullen again the next day at a golf tournament. And after the second meeting, a connection was definitely established. And the reason we know this is because Priscilla actually called Cullen a few days later while Cullen was in Paris for an international air show. She had actually called Cullen to ask him if he could get her tickets to the preseason Cowboys-Packers game. Although he said no, Cullen called her back to ask her on a date. And it was on that trip to Paris that Sandra actually filed for divorce from Cullen. It seemed like both Priscilla and Cullen were at the ending stages of their current marriages, but the marriages hadn't been finalized yet. And when Jack found out about Priscilla and Cullen, he was definitely not happy about this, so much so that he actually hired a team of private investigators to kick down the door of a hotel that Cullen and Priscilla were staying at and sprayed them with mace and took photos of them being intimate. Jack then used these images that the private investigators got in his case against Priscilla during their divorce. And as a result of these images, he was actually awarded custody of their kids. Priscilla was allowed visitation, so she did get to see them often. But the fact that Jack got custody because of the affair that Priscilla was having with Cullen is just crazy. And despite all of this craziness, Priscilla and Cullen's relationship progressed. The two of them eventually made plans to get married, and they eventually followed through, and they got married on August 29th, 1968. But this day was more than just a celebration of their marriage. Just a few hours before the couple said I do, Cullen's father, Kenneth, passed away. His death was just a few months after his wife's death, Cullen's mother, Alice. Many people question why they continued to go through with the wedding that day. I mean, his father had just passed away. But Cullen said that he knew that his father was going to die sometime before. So the festivities carried on. And now not only did Cullen have a new wife, but he also had an equal share of his father's oil empire. By 1968, the brothers all had equal parts ownership in a business conglomerate worth more than $800 million. The brothers still had to decide who would take over their father's estate. And they believed that whoever did take over his estate would ultimately hold the most power. Cullen decided to abandon the pursuit for his father's estate, even though he knew he was going to ultimately take over the family business. And instead, he embarked on a 4-year journey to build his own estate, known as Stonegate Mansion. The mansion was completed in 1972 and cost more than $6 million, which in today's money would be equivalent to $45 million. This mansion was equipped with 5 massive bedrooms, 11 bathrooms, an indoor pool, and so much more. One thing that added value to the mansion, though, was art. Cullen spent years cultivating works of art he wanted in his home. He hung more than 100 valuable oil paintings in his house. But the mansion was home to more than just Cullen and Priscilla. It was also home to the most extravagant parties thrown in the Fort Worth, Texas area. The Stonegate Mansion was where the elite came to party, and it was rumored that these parties were filled with drugs and orgies. Despite people being aware of Cullen's temper, people still flocked to the Stonegate Mansion. Cullen often spared no expense for his lifestyle, but Priscilla had an even bigger spending habit. The two would take frequent trips on his private jet, and those that saw Priscilla often just took her as the pretty girl on Cullen's arm. Priscilla would often wear tight and revealing clothing and would love to show off her newly augmented breasts. Her bleach blonde hair was a big part of her identity, as well as a diamond-studded necklace which she wore that said, "Rich Bitch." Many describe Priscilla as being a human fireworks show for her flamboyant personality. Although her ex-husband had custody of their children, Priscilla's 3 kids often stayed with him at the mansion. Again, their names were Dee, Jackie, and Andrea. Even though they were technically step-siblings, they were the result of 2 marriages. Dee, the oldest child, said that they were very close. They really didn't even consider themselves half-siblings at all.
Jackie, Andrea, and myself, we grew up together. We didn't even think of ourselves as half.
And during the early years of their marriage, Priscilla, Cullen, and the 3 children were generally very happy. But Cullen did exhibit a lot of the same strict tendencies that he grew up with. Dinner was always served at the same time every night, and he was very impatient if things didn't go as planned. And eventually, it didn't take long for Cullen's temper to make an appearance. And sadly, that temper turned into abuse. In one instance, Cullen actually punched Dee in the nose after she just forgot to lock the back door. And when Priscilla came to her daughter's rescue, Cullen punished Priscilla by taking her cat and ending its life. There was another instance where Cullen went off the rails. Andrea was just doing her math homework, and they got into a dispute about a math equation, and Cullen actually threatened to kick Andrea out of the house because of this. Andrea also got very upset when Cullen called her stupid and went to her room. But when it was time for dinner, Cullen called her down, and when she wouldn't come down, Cullen threatened to kick her out and never let her come back. Priscilla remembers his abuse getting worse and worse over time, and he would just get upset over the slightest reason. There's even a situation where Cullen physically beat her with crutches that Priscilla had after she had had a skiing accident. So their marriage got very, very toxic and very abusive very quickly. And it didn't take long for Priscilla to start thinking about getting a divorce from Cullen. Cullen was seeing other women at the time, but he was not about to let Priscilla divorce him. Priscilla did ultimately file for divorce in July of 1974, and she said that during the court proceedings for it, Cullen was just acting super childish. For example, Cullen actually went and took all of Priscilla's jewelry and locked it in his office so she couldn't get access to it. I believe that by the time the divorce was finalized, Cullen wasn't living in the mansion anymore. He'd actually started living with a woman he had been seeing. And to the surprise of many, Priscilla was actually awarded the Stonegate Mansion. She was also awarded one of the nicer cars, as well as spousal and child support from Cullen. The kids weren't actually biologically related to Cullen, but because they had gotten married and Cullen had legally adopted them, he was still responsible for paying child support for them. A judge also issued a restraining order so that Cullen could not visit Priscilla and the kids at the mansion. And until the two could agree on a settlement, a judge actually froze Cullen's assets. Part of his assets that were frozen were his business assets, which angered his brothers and business partners. His younger brother actually filed a lawsuit against Cullen and his older brother, saying that the two were conspiring to kick him out of the company. On November 8th, 1974, Cullen petitioned a judge to allow him to sell 44,000 shares of his drilling company, which would provide him with $1.4 million. But the judge rejected his petition. This really pissed Cullen off, and to add fuel to the fire, the same judge who rejected his petition then ordered that he increase his spousal support from $2,500 per month to $3,500 per month. By the end of 1974, it's believed that Cullen's spending habits got the best of him and jeopardized not only his personal finances, but that of the oil empire his father had worked so hard to build. It's estimated that in November of 1974, Cullen was in $16 million of personal debt and more than $150 million in business debt. But even with this debt, Cullen kept living his best life, and 1975 was a seemingly quiet year in terms of Cullen's life. It was around this time that he began dating a woman named Karen Master, who would eventually become his third wife. Many believe that his interest in Karen was because her appearance was very similar to Priscilla's, as she had the same blonde hair and same body type as his previous wife. Karen also had 2 other children from a previous marriage who Cullen would eventually adopt. But Cullen wasn't the only one to move on. Priscilla found love again with a man named Stan Farr. Stan was a former basketball star at Texas Christian University, and he became Priscilla's new boyfriend. It didn't take long for Stan to move into the Stonegate Mansion, where he lived there with Priscilla and oftentimes with her 3 children. On July 30th, 1976, the same day that Priscilla turned 35 years old, she had had a court hearing regarding her divorce with Cullen, and the judge had granted an increase in her alimony payments. Now, instead of sending her $3,500 per month, Cullen was now responsible for $5,000 payments. Considering his worsening financial situation, all the debt that he was in, he was very, very pissed about this increase in money he'd now have to pay Priscilla every month. But at this point, Cullen said, I just want to move on with my life, so I'm just going to go ahead and make these payments. But just 2 days later after this, tragedy struck Priscilla and her family. On this day, Priscilla's youngest daughter, Andrea, was home alone after a Bible study at the mansion when someone came in and shot her twice, execution style, and ended her life. Andrea was only 12 years old at the time of her death. Andrea was an amazing young girl. She was an animal lover at heart. She was young, but very mature for her age. Her favorite color was pink, and she had a passion for cooking.
She was just an animal magnet and just the sweetest, absolute sweetest kid.
But sadly, after the intruder murdered Andrea, they weren't finished yet. Just after midnight, Priscilla and Stan were coming home from a night out. They had gone out to dinner and headed over to one more place to have a drink before heading home. While they were out, they happened to run into a young woman named Bev and her boyfriend, Bubba. Bev was a friend of Dee, Priscilla's oldest daughter. Dee was supposed to be home that night, but instead went out to a party. We later learned that Cullen told Dee to be home that night, and lucky for her, she wasn't in the house when the intruder striked. Dee actually told Bev that she could sleep over at the mansion and she would meet her there after the party, not knowing that later that night her little sister would be murdered. Bev didn't mention to Priscilla that she would be sleeping over that night, but figured she would see her later. So they parted ways, and Priscilla and Stan finished their date and drove back to the mansion. Right when they got back to the property though, Priscilla noticed that the security lights had been turned off, which was startling considering she always turned them on before she left. Despite this, she still entered her home, but within a few seconds, Priscilla was standing in her kitchen when she noticed blood on the door leading down to the basement. It was then that a man wearing all black, wearing a women's black wig, stepped out with a bag over his hand. Priscilla says that she immediately identified this man as none other than Cullen Davis. The man then proceeded to say hi and then shot Priscilla in the stomach. Priscilla then called out to Stan, and as he ran down the stairs, the intruder shot him. The first shot went through a door and penetrated his abdomen. After that, the intruder then shot Stan a few more times, ending his life. The shooter then began to drag Stan across the floor, closer to the kitchen. Priscilla knew that the intruder would then finish her off, so she didn't waste any time and made her way out of the house into the courtyard. But before she could escape, the intruder caught up with her. The intruder, who Priscilla believed was Cullen, then started dragging her back inside. But once again, when he wasn't looking, she picked up her skirt and ran. This time she was able to dive into a bush for safety. Just as she did, she noticed a car approaching and she heard voices. Priscilla feared it was Dee and that she too was about to be killed. But the voices were actually Bubba and Bev. The two also noticed the man in black, and not knowing the horror which was inside, they assumed that this man was robbing the place. But just like the others before them, it was too late for them to run. The shooter then approached them and gunshots rang out. Only Bubba was hit, and luckily he survived, but later on, he would become paralyzed for the rest of his life due to his injuries. Bev also later identified the shooter as none other than Cullen Davis. As this was all unfolding, Priscilla was able to run to a neighbor's house and call the police. By the time the police arrived, the shooter was long gone. Priscilla immediately told them that she knew who the shooter was. Before they had a chance to find him at Karen's house, Cullen received a phone call from his brother. He asked if he heard the news about the shooting. Cullen's response was, "Who got shot?" And then he told his brother he was going back to sleep. Basically, he just seemed unbothered by the news. Just after 4:15 a.m., officers arrived at Karen Masters' house and arrested Cullen under suspicion of murder and attempted murder. When the police questioned him about his whereabouts that night, Cullen said that he had an alibi. He said that he had gone out to a movie, actually to go see Bad News Bears. But later on, we'd find out that that movie was most likely not playing that night. And then he said after they went to the movie, they came back to Karen's house and he was there for the rest of the night. But obviously the police were going to look into this a little bit more and they ended up arresting Cullen anyway. And that same night at the hospital, Priscilla told Dee that she believed that the identity of the intruder was in fact her ex-husband.
A still distraught Priscilla in the emergency room, whispering a warning.
She said, "Dee, Cullen shot me." I said, "Okay, I understand.
Now that Cullen was in custody, he had to figure out how to get out of jail. And because he was such a wealthy individual in the Fort Worth, Texas area, and he just had a lot of pull there, he was easily able to pay his $80,000 bond and get himself out. But despite being a free man on August 20th, Cullen was arrested again moments before he tried to board his private jet. Cullen said he was just flying to Houston for work, but many believe he was actually going to try to flee the country. But this time around, his bail was denied because the charges that were being levied against him were very, very serious. He was being charged with capital murder. When Cullen was arrested, he of course enlisted the best defense that money could buy, and that's when he hired attorney Richard Racehorse Haynes. Even though he was denied bail, him and his lawyer weren't going to accept that. Cullen actually offered to pay for 2 federal marshals to watch over him full time, speak with a probation officer every 2 hours, and surrender all forms of identification and credit cards. But this didn't work. He was still denied bail. In the late 1970s, Cullen was going to be the wealthiest person to ever be charged with capital murder. And lucky for him, his attorney, nicknamed Racehorse, had quite the PR campaign planned. Racehorse was determined to make the community fall in love with Cullen. And lucky for them, he was already loved by a lot of people in Fort Worth. As a handsome, wealthy man known for throwing the most insane parties, he was backed by many elite members of the community. He actually also garnered a lot of support from his very own employees.
Strataflex is an international company, one of several Cullen Davis controlled. Employees here at the Fort Worth office and at offices around the world have written Davis offering their support and their belief in his innocence. They reportedly don't believe their boss killed anyone here last summer, as prosecutors claim. At the Westside Mansion, Davis's stepdaughter and his wife's boyfriend were both gunned to death.
But him and his attorney's main plan was to pit people against his ex, Priscilla, which they knew wouldn't be very hard because many people already looked at her as the self-proclaimed rich bitch. Even before their divorce, people they knew didn't like her, and they used this to their advantage and had the media basically drag her and call her a liar. And when the trial came around, this was the exact image that Racehorse was planning to use against her. Cullen's defense relied heavily on these 2 things. First, there was no physical evidence linking Cullen to the Stonegate Mansion murders, and second was that Priscilla was an unreliable witness. In the course of a 13-week trial, Priscilla spent 11 weeks on the stand. Racehorse painted her as a woman who was addicted to painkillers who had ties to many drug dealers. They even had the audacity to call her a second worlder, meaning that she had ties to 2 worlds at once. The second being her drug-induced world, which would make anything she says unreliable, including testimony that her husband was the killer.
Cullen's lead attorney, Houston's Richard Racehorse Haynes, went after Priscilla. Allegations of drug use, wild sex parties.
They were so consumed with my mother's appearance, her bad girl image. And guess what? It wasn't about her.
It was this cross-examination of Priscilla that made many believe the defense was going to win this high-profile murder trial. Without evidence, the prosecution had to focus on motive. They believed the change in spousal support was what triggered the killing spree. But public opinion still favored Cullen, even if his defense tactics were shady. The trial ended on November 17, 1977, after a very quick jury deliberation. And what's absolutely insane is that the jury came back and actually acquitted Cullen of capital murder. At this point, Cullen thought he was scot-free, but his days in court were far from being over. Not long after the trial ended, Stan Farr's children actually sued Cullen for wrongful death. Although this lawsuit never made it to court, there was an undisclosed settlement reached. You're probably wondering, how the hell did Cullen get acquitted of capital murder when there was multiple witnesses that identified him as a shooter that night? Well, the number one reason for his acquittal is his wealth. This was one of the first times in a U.S. trial where money became extremely important. Some believe that Cullen's wealth bought him the support and therefore the win in court. Because he was so wealthy, he was able to spend loads of money on his defense. He actually spent $1.6 million on his lawyers and $400,000 on his own investigators. The outcome of this trial also made Racehorse, his attorney, extremely famous, and he was soon named one of the top 6 criminal lawyers in the country. But like I just mentioned before, Cullen's days in court were not over, and therefore neither were the days of Racehorse representing him. So get this. Less than a year after his first trial, Cullen was arrested again after being accused of hiring a hitman to kill 15 people, including Priscilla and the judge who presided over his divorce. And what was drastically different about this case versus the first one he beat was the fact that the prosecution actually had evidence. Cullen's second trial began on October 30th, 1977. In the state of Texas versus Cullen T. Davis, the prosecution alleged that Cullen hired a man named David McCrory to kill 15 individuals. They said that unbeknownst to Cullen, David contacted the FBI and began working undercover to record their conversations and financial transactions so they could make the arrest. And the FBI got their evidence. They had 4 recordings of David and Cullen's interactions. This included $25,000 in cash they said that Cullen gave to David, a fake photo of the judge's dead body, and a pistol with a silencer on it that Cullen allegedly gave to David. The recorded interaction between David and Cullen reportedly happened outside of Coco's hamburger restaurant. David pretended that he actually had the body of the judge, whom he said Cullen wanted dead, in order to make the story more convincing. During this recorded interaction, David told Cullen that the judge was dead and that he would continue killing the other people that Cullen wanted dead. Again, this was a sting operation, so minutes after this whole interaction concluded, the police moved in to arrest Cullen once again. And this time, despite all the evidence they had against Cullen, Cullen and Racehorse had the same plan in mind, and that was to pin all of this on Priscilla once again. During this trial, Cullen testified that it was Priscilla who had set it all up. He said he got a call from an FBI agent who told him that Priscilla was working with someone to set him up for murder. And when he was meeting with David, he was just pretending to go along with it all. Cullen said he knew about the tapes and was okay with them being recorded because he planned to use them later in court against Priscilla. And for Racehorse, he didn't have to prove that his client was not guilty. He just had to create reasonable doubt. And what helped secure the defense's arguments was the fact that the prosecution didn't have fingerprints on three very important items: the $25,000 cash, the gun, and the doctored photograph of the dead judge. Along with pinning it on Priscilla, attacking the physical evidence was going to be their best bet for a victory in this case. If Cullen's fingerprints weren't on the money, then how was the prosecution going to prove that Cullen had actually given David the money? And without his fingerprints on the gun, they couldn't prove it was Cullen who handed over to David for the killings. They also put a discourse analyst on the stand who testified that Cullen's words in the tape didn't constitute soliciting murder. And unlike the first trial where the public opinion favored Cullen, many people felt split about this trial. But after 44 hours of deliberation, the jury came back hung, and Cullen was acquitted in another high-profile trial. At this point, Cullen had been acquitted of capital murder, and now he had been acquitted of murder for hire. He was a free man once again. In the years that followed the trial, things really weren't looking up. Cullen actually lost most of his wealth in the recession in the 1980s. As for his family business, Ken Davis Industries, they actually had to file for bankruptcy in 1985. This happened after the conglomerate lost $61.1 million in 1983 and $71 million in the first 9 months of 1984. It was projected that he owed 8 banks upwards of $440 million. By the end of the 1980s, Cullen and Karen had fully devoted themselves to finding God and became active members in their church, the Assembly of God. For the next 10-15 years or so, both Priscilla and Cullen went and just lived out their normal lives. Sadly, though, in 2001, Priscilla passed away from breast cancer. And then 15 years later, Cullen's wife, Karen, died of organ failure. To this day, Cullen, who is now in his 80s, still maintains his innocence. He says it was not him who committed those murders that night in the Stonegate Mansion. He said he doesn't know who it is now, although before he did say he had a few names he thought of people who it could have been, but now he just says he has no idea who it is, and that is up to the police to figure it out. So I want to show you a couple clips from this interview they did with Cullen because honestly it just creeped me out. There's just something about him that just seems off, and he just seems to be hiding behind his faith now, which is very convenient, but I don't know. I still get very, very eerie feelings for him.
You've never had a wig?
No.
Never had any involvement in any kind of plan?
No.
You're absolutely 100% not guilty of this.
That's absolutely 100% right.
As for the Stonegate Mansion, at one point it became a Mexican restaurant and eventually it became a wedding venue, but I believe it has since been demolished. And as of today, there's really been no other updates in any of these cases. Cullen, who is the primary suspect and really only suspect I think the police looked at, has been acquitted of capital murder. As of today, Cullen is no longer as wealthy as he used to be. He lives in a pretty normal house, normal neighborhood, and he's just living out the rest of his days. And he says he's forgiven everybody about this, and I guess Priscilla's family has forgiven him for the events, but he still says he had nothing to do with the murders of Priscilla's daughter and Stan. I mean, those two still have no justice. And he seems to think that there's somebody else out there who committed the murders and the police just never found them. But I tend to lean towards that this was absolutely Cullen. And because he was so wealthy and he was literally paying off the DA's office to give him information. I mean, this trial was just completely corrupted by money, wealth, and just his reputation that he had in the Fort Worth area. I think if he had been tried outside of the area where he lived, I think the trial would have been much different. And I think he probably would have been found guilty of these murders. I just don't understand how the police didn't have more evidence. I mean, from the crime scenes, this wasn't like a squeaky clean job. You know, if this was a hit job, I think this would have been way, way different. I mean, there must have been DNA from the intruder somewhere in that house. It just seems like the police really didn't know what they were doing, or just that evidence never got presented. I don't know what happened with this one, but it seems very obvious to me that Cullen is likely the one who committed the murders and is now living out the rest of his days, playing pool, doing whatever he wants. And because he is now a Christian, he is forgiven. And yeah, it's like it never happened, which is just, I don't know. I just don't understand that at all. I've researched a lot of serial killers, and it's interesting that you find that many serial killers end up finding God in prison as well and find forgiveness, which after you do heinous acts like murder, to me, it seems very convenient to be like, oh, God has forgiven me. I only have to answer to God. And now, you know, I can just wipe myself clean of these horrific acts I committed earlier in my life and move on. There's just something very wrong about that to me. But I want to know what your thoughts are on this case. Who do you think committed those murders in the Stonegate Mansion? Was it Cullen? Or is it possible Cullen hired a hitman? But let me know your thoughts in the comments below. This case really just pisses me off. I can't believe there's not been justice for Stan and Priscilla. And I don't know if we'll ever see it, but talking about it, we can only hope that maybe new evidence might be found and justice will be served. But I'm going to go ahead and wrap up today's video there. Thanks for joining me. Hopefully I did okay. I know I'm no Kendall Rae, but I think I gave my best shot at it. But Kendall will be back very soon. She loves all of you, and I thank you for watching today's video. Again, if you want to see more of me, I'm on the Mile Higher Podcast, the Lights Out Podcast. You can find me over there. Also on social media at Mile Higher Josh. But I will see you guys later.